Please don't let them take my sister away." The plea came from a 14-year-old black boy, barefoot, soaking wet, clutching the leather vest of a Hell's Angel named Duke. Behind him, a social worker's sedan crunched to a stop. Duke looked down at the desperate child, then raised a hand. 8 bikers stepped forward and formed an unbreakable wall. "Nobody's taking her anywhere, son. Let's go have a talk." 3 months after they buried their mother, the foster system decided to separate Marcus and Layla. Thursday morning, the social worker came to finalize the split. Marcus ran barefoot down the street, straight toward the only people who looked like they didn't answer to anyone, the Hell's Angels. He didn't know Duke, didn't know that grabbing that leather vest would trigger a 40-year-old wound. Duke's own brother had been taken by the same system, and Duke had been waiting decades for this moment. Thursday started like every other morning in the cramped apartment on Cox Avenue, except it wasn't. The social worker, Carla Henning, had called twice the night before to confirm the transfer. 8 a.m. sharp. Layla to a group home in Canton, Marcus to a facility outside Akron. 70 miles apart. They had been inseparable since their mother's overdose 3 months ago, surviving on cereal and whatever Marcus could scrape together. He had sold their mother's television, her jewelry, even her winter coat, just to keep the lights on. And now the system was going to undo all of it with a signature. At 7:15, Marcus sat on the edge of Layla's bed, watching her sleep. She had dimples even when she dreamed, a stuffed rabbit tucked under her chin, the one their mother had won at the county fair the summer before she got bad. He didn't want to wake her. He wanted to freeze this moment, the last one where they were still a family. But the clock on the microwave blinked 7:16, and the knot in his stomach pulled tighter. He had been the man of the house since he was 12, ever since their mother started disappearing for days. Now he was 14, and he was about to lose the only person who made any of it bearable. The problem wasn't just the separation. The problem was that the guardian assigned to Layla had a sealed juvenile record, something the foster agency either missed or ignored. Marcus had found the paperwork 3 weeks earlier in a manila envelope left on the kitchen counter by a caseworker who clearly didn't care. He couldn't prove anything yet, but he knew, the way a brother knows when his sister is in danger, that Layla was headed somewhere unsafe. And nobody in the entire system would listen to a 14-year-old kid from the wrong side of town. By 7:45, Layla was awake and crying. She clung to Marcus's arm, her little voice cracking. "Don't let them take me. Please, Marcus, don't let them." He told her it would be okay, but the lie tasted like ash. He had no plan. He had no power. He had no adult in his corner. The only thing he had was a pair of worn-out sneakers and a clear view of the abandoned gas station from his bedroom window, where every morning he noticed the same thing during his walk to school: a pack of motorcycles, leather vests, and the winged skull that made most people cross the street. At 7:52, he heard the sedan's engine. Carla was early. He saw her through the blinds, clipboard in hand, already heading up the walkway, and something inside him snapped. He kissed Layla on the forehead, told her to stay quiet, and slipped out the back door. No shoes, just bare feet on wet pavement. The gas station was 3 blocks down, and the rumble of engines told him they were there. He didn't think. He just ran, legs burning, heart pounding, with nothing left to lose and a sister's future hanging in the balance. The social worker's sedan pulled into the driveway behind him, and Marcus was gone. He was 2 blocks away when the first engine cut. The gas station loomed ahead, 3 Harleys already parked with 2 more pulling up. Marcus didn't slow down. His bare feet slapped the cracked asphalt, and by the time he reached the edge of the lot, the biggest man there was stepping off his bike. Duke Archer, 62 years old, 52 of them in this club. Salt and pepper beard down to his sternum, a tattoo of a weeping angel on his left arm for a daughter who made it, and a faded scar on his right hand from a foster home he never talked about. He was built like a refrigerator, but his eyes were the thing that stopped people. They were the color of a winter sky, and in this moment they locked onto a barefoot black boy sprinting toward him with no fear. Marcus didn't slow down. He ran straight into Duke and grabbed fistfuls of leather vest, his voice cracking into a raw scream. "Please don't let them take my sister away." The words tumbled out so fast they nearly tangled. Duke felt the kid's whole body shaking, saw tears streaking through dirt on his cheeks, and somewhere beneath 40 years of callous silence, a door he'd bolted shut swung open. He saw himself at 9 years old, watching his older brother Terrence get shoved into a state car while a social worker told him it was for the best. He never saw Terrence again. That was 1971, and Duke had spent every year since building a wall of leather and ink to keep that memory out. But right now, with this kid's desperate grip on his chest, the wall didn't hold. Behind Marcus, the social worker's sedan had already rounded the corner. Carla Henning stepped out, clipboard pressed to her chest, eyes narrowing at the scene. She had been doing this job for 11 years and had a weary, bureaucratic impatience. "Marcus, you need to come back to the house now. This is not appropriate." Duke raised one hand, not at her, at his men. 7 Hell's Angels, all of whom had been watching silently, moved like a single machine. They formed a line between the sedan and the boy, a solid wall of leather and crossed arms. No one spoke. No one threatened. They just stood there immovable, their silence heavier than any words. Carla stopped walking, her professional composure cracking just slightly. She had dealt with angry parents and difficult relatives, but she had never been faced with 8 bikers who looked like they could intimidate a thunderstorm. Duke crouched down to Marcus's level. His voice was low, gravelly, but steady. "Nobody's taking her anywhere, son. Not right now. What's your sister's name?" Marcus choked out. "Layla, she's 8. Duke nodded slowly, then stood up and faced Carla. "Ma'am, I understand you have a job to do, but I'm asking you to hold off for a few hours. This boy has something to say, and I'm going to listen." Carla started to protest about protocols and court orders, but one of the bikers, a lean man named Rook with a tattoo of a chess piece on his neck, stepped forward and said calmly, "We ain't stopping you from doing your job. We're just asking you to wait while we make some phone calls. We got a lawyer who can be here in 30 minutes. The mention of a lawyer threw her. She glanced at the wall of men, at Marcus, who was now clinging to Duke's arm, and at the phone in Rook's hand. She said, "I'll give you 1 hour," then walked back to her car, phone already pressed to her ear. Duke led Marcus inside the abandoned gas station office, a grimy room with a busted vending machine and a few metal chairs. He gave the boy a bottle of water and asked him to start from the beginning. Marcus talked. He talked about his mother, how she tried so hard until the drugs took her, and how Layla was the only good thing left. He talked about the manila envelope and the Guardian's sealed record, the one the caseworker said was probably nothing. Duke listened without interrupting. Then he pulled out his own phone and called a number he hadn't dialed in 3 years. The man who picked up was Vince Holloway, a retired family court judge who owed Duke a debt that couldn't be repaid in money. 22 years ago, Duke's club had found Vince's runaway daughter in a bad situation and brought her home safe. Vince had never forgotten. Duke explained the situation, spoke for maybe 3 minutes, then hung up and looked at Marcus. "Judge is pulling files right now. If what you found is true, your sister's guardian has already violated placement terms. That means the whole order falls apart." Marcus stared at him, hope flickering across his face for the first time in months. But he didn't know yet that the guardian wasn't just negligent. The guardian had an active warrant in a neighboring county for aggravated assault on a minor. The system had placed Layla with a man who should have been behind bars. And in 45 minutes, when that truth came crashing down, the entire foster agency would be scrambling to contain a scandal they had been hiding for years. The phone call from Judge Vince Holloway took 19 minutes. When Duke stepped back into the grimy gas station office, his face was carved from granite. Marcus looked up from the metal chair, his bare feet still flecked with gravel, his eyes scanning Duke's expression for any crack of hope. Duke didn't make him wait. He crouched down, voice low and deliberate. "The guardian they assigned to Layla, a man named Randall Stokes, has an active warrant in Stark County, aggravated assault on a 12-year-old boy. He should have been flagged the moment his name entered the system. He was." Marcus's face went pale. It was worse than he had imagined. Not negligence. Not a mistake. A predator handed keys to the front door. Outside, Carla Henning's 1-hour deadline was ticking. She sat in her sedan, phone pressed to her ear, her supervisor's voice crackling through the line. Terrence Aldridge, the foster agency's regional director, had spent 20 years protecting the institution's reputation more than its children. His orders were blunt. The placement is court-ordered. Any delay will reflect badly on the department. You tell those bikers to stand down or I'm calling the sheriff. Carla hesitated. She had a daughter of her own, Layla's age, and something about Marcus's desperate sprint had lodged in her chest. But she was career staff. She did what she was told. She stepped out of the car and walked toward the wall of leather. The 7 Hells Angels hadn't moved. Rook, the lean biker with the chest piece tattoo, watched her approach like a man who'd seen every bureaucratic bluff in the book. "Ma'am, I'd stop right there," he said, not unkindly. "Our lawyer's 10 minutes out. You're going to want to hear what he has." Carla opened her mouth to argue, but Rook held up a phone. On the screen was a mugshot. Randall Stokes, 51, hollow eyes, a scar across his left cheek. Below it, the stark text of a warrant number, a charge code, and the words active, violent offender. Carla stared at the image and her professional confidence cracked. She had processed Stokes's paperwork herself 3 weeks ago. She hadn't run a secondary background check because the system flagged him as vetted. The system had lied. What came next was a collapse nobody saw coming. Duke's lawyer, a sharp-willed man named Elias Grant who defended club members for 2 decades, arrived in a cloud of dust. He didn't come alone. He brought a transcript of a disciplinary hearing from 3 years earlier, buried deep in a county archive, in which a caseworker testified that Randall Stokes had been removed as a foster parent after an incident involving a child in his care. The caseworker, a woman named Gloria Simmons, had been overruled by Aldridge himself, who reinstated Stokes citing lack of evidence. The transcript had never been produced in court because someone had misfiled it, or hid it. Now it was in Grant's hands, and within minutes of his arrival, he had faxed it to the family court judge overseeing the the Marcus and Layla placement. Duke stood in the doorway of the gas station, watching this unfold like a man who had long ago stopped trusting any institution but his club. Marcus was beside him, still trembling, but something else was rising in him now. The first glimmer of a world where someone listened. Duke's own history came back to him then, not in words but in the weight of his silence. His older brother Terrence had been taken from a home just like this, placed with a guardian who turned out to be abusive. Little Terrence had no Hell's Angel to call. He had no one. Duke had spent a lifetime covering that wound with leather and ink, but now the boy beside him was living the same nightmare, and Duke had a choice. He was done letting the system win. The sheriff's deputies arrived at 12 minutes past the deadline. 2 cars, 4 officers, summoned by Aldridge to enforce the original court order. They expected a confrontation. They found 8 bikers, a lawyer, and a social worker who had just realized she was complicit in a cover-up. Carla stepped forward before the lead deputy could speak. "Officer, I'm requesting a delay. There are irregularities in this placement that need immediate review." The deputy, a seasoned man named Holcomb, glanced at the mugshot on Rook's phone, then at the fax transcript in Grant's hand. He radioed his supervisor. The order came back, "Stand down." Aldridge's authority in this moment had evaporated, but the worst revelation was still coming. While the deputies conferred, Grant's phone buzzed. It was Judge Holloway again. The judge had kept digging, calling in every chit he had from 3 decades on the bench. What he found turned the case from a tragedy into a criminal conspiracy. Randall Stokes was not an isolated oversight. He was part of a network of unvetted guardians that the agency had been using for years to offload difficult placements quickly, cutting corners on background checks to meet state performance metrics. At least 7 children had been placed with Stokes since 2017. 2 had reported abuse, but their complaints were dismissed by caseworkers under pressure from Aldridge. This wasn't a mistake. It was a factory line of harm, and Layla Tate had been next in line. Aldridge, realizing his house of cards was tumbling, tried to launch a counterattack. He called the Ohio Department of Children and Families and demanded an emergency review of the bikers' interference, painting Duke as a gang leader who had abducted a foster child. But the narrative shattered the moment a local reporter, tipped off by a deputy who couldn't stomach the silence, arrived at the gas station with a camera and a notebook. Her name was Sonia Cross, and she had spent 10 years covering systemic failures in Ohio's foster care. She started filming, asking questions the agency never wanted asked. By late afternoon, her story was live on the evening news. A barefoot boy, a wall of bikers, a hidden scandal stretching back years. Inside the gas station, a quiet, pivotal exchange happened. Layla, who had slipped out of the apartment after Marcus, had been found by one of Duke's men, a gentle giant named Bear, sitting on the curb 2 blocks away, terrified but unharmed. Bear carried her back to the gas station wrapped in his leather vest. Marcus saw her and crumpled into sobs. She ran into his arms and they held each other while the bikers formed a protective ring around them. Duke stood apart, watching, and finally let a tear fall. He hadn't cried since 1971. He didn't wipe it away. By nightfall, the emergency court hearing had been convened over video. Judge Holloway, still sitting in his den but wielding full authority, issued a temporary emergency order placing Marcus and Layla together in a licensed foster home vetted by an independent monitor. The club's lawyer was granted interim guardianship oversight, a near unprecedented arrangement that acknowledged the catastrophic failure of the state agency. Aldridge was placed on administrative leave pending a criminal investigation. The sheriff's office opened a formal inquiry, and Marcus, who had started the day with nothing but bare feet and a desperate hope, fell asleep on a cot in the gas station office. Layla curled beside him, a Hell's Angel standing watch at the door. But the fight was far from over. The agency still had powerful allies in the state capitol. Aldridge hired a crisis firm. They argued that the bikers' involvement was a threat to child welfare, a gang inserting itself into the system. They threatened to appeal the custody order, to drag the case through courts for months while the children were stuck in limbo. The battle was moving from the street to courtroom, and Duke knew one thing. The only way to win was to expose the full scope of the cover-up and force a reckoning so loud that no judge could look away. That meant finding Gloria Simmons, the caseworker who had tried to stop Stokes years ago and been silenced. She had disappeared from state records, her last known address a trailer in Kentucky. If they could find her, she could bring the whole corrupt machinery down. And if they couldn't, Marcus and Layla might still be torn apart. The search for Gloria Simmons took 3 days. Rook and Bear rode 800 miles to a trailer park outside Paducah, Kentucky, where Gloria had been living under a name that wasn't hers, waiting for a knock she always knew would come. She answered the door with a cigarette in one hand and a worn manila folder in the other. Inside were copies of every memo she'd sent, every report she'd filed, every email Aldridge had deleted. She had been blacklisted for refusing to stay silent. "I couldn't save those other kids," she told Rook, her voice raw with years of grief, "but I made sure I could save the next one." She climbed onto the back of Bear's Harley with nothing but that folder and a duffel bag, and they rode through the night back to Ohio. The emergency custody hearing resumed 2 days later in a courtroom packed with reporters, bikers, and foster care advocates who had driven in from 3 states. Gloria took the stand. For 2 hours, she methodically dismantled the agency's defense. She produced the memo from 2018 in which Aldridge had personally ordered her case file on Stokes to be administratively closed. She read aloud the email where a supervisor told her, "We don't have the resources to rescreen every file." She described the pattern of children, nearly all from poor black and brown families, who were funneled into unlicensed placements because the agency needed the beds cleared. By the time she finished, Aldridge's crisis lawyer had stopped objecting and just sat staring at the table. Judge Holloway recessed for 20 minutes and returned with a ruling that reshaped the entire case. Custody of Marcus and Layla was removed from the state's authority permanently and transferred to a licensed, vetted foster home. A retired schoolteacher named Alina Vance, who had raised 5 children of her own and had been recommended by the club's attorney after an exhaustive background check. The siblings would not be separated. They would attend the same school, sleep under the same roof, and finally have the stability they had been denied for years. Aldridge was taken into custody outside the courtroom by sheriff's deputies, charged with child endangerment, evidence tampering, and conspiracy. Randall Stokes was arrested the same morning in Stark County, the warrant for aggravated assault finally executed after years of bureaucratic neglect. But the moment that broke everyone in the room came after the gavel fell. Duke, who had sat in the back row for the entire hearing with his cut zipped tight and his jaw clenched, rose and asked to address the court. He had never spoken publicly about his own childhood, never told anyone outside the club about the brother ripped from him in 1971. But he told them now. He told them about little Terrence, the state car that swallowed him whole, the social worker who said it's for the best. He told them how he'd spent 50 years building a wall of silence around that loss, and how a barefoot boy with nothing left to lose had crashed straight through it. His voice cracked, and he didn't try to hide it. I couldn't save my brother, but I can make sure these two never spend a night apart. Then he reached into his vest and pulled out a folded piece of paper. He handed it to Marcus. It was an apprenticeship contract, signed by Duke's custom bike shop foreman, offering full training in motorcycle mechanics starting the day Marcus turned 16. It came with a stipend, a path to a trade license, and a promise of permanent employment. Duke looked at the boy and said, "You ran to the right gas station, son. Now you got a future." Marcus opened the paper, read it once, read it again, and then broke down in sobs that were half relief, half joy. Layla hugged him from the side. Alina Vance put a hand on his shoulder, and Duke, the biggest, hardest man in the room, bent his head and let the tears fall. The little boy who ran barefoot down Cox Avenue had found not just a protector, but a family. And the old biker who'd buried his tears for 50 years had finally found a reason to cry. You know what stays with me about this story? It's not the courtroom drama or the 18 arrests that followed the state investigation. It's the moment before all of that. A barefoot boy on wet pavement who had no reason to believe anyone would listen, running toward a group of men that society had told him to fear. And those men, covered in ink and leather, didn't flinch. They didn't ask if he was dangerous. They just saw a kid who needed someone to stand between him and a system that had already failed him. Duke turned out to be that someone. Not because he was a hero, but because he recognized the same terrified child he once was. He'd buried that pain for 50 years. Marcus dug it up in 20 seconds. And because of that, an entire corrupt network inside the foster agency was exposed. 18 caseworkers and supervisors were indicted. Randall Stokes was sentenced to 19 years. Aldridge is still fighting his charges, but his career is ash. Marcus and Layla spent last Christmas with Alina Vance, and every Saturday Duke rides out to see them. Marcus turns 16 this fall. He starts his apprenticeship the day after his birthday. But here's what I keep asking myself. What if Duke had been just one more door that stayed shut? The social worker was already in the driveway. The separation order was signed. 6 more minutes and Layla would have been gone. That's how thin the line was between tragedy and this happy outcome. 6 minutes and one man's decision to listen. So I want you to sit with this question, not the comfortable version, the real one. If a desperate kid ran up to you in a gas station parking lot, no shoes, no hope, would you have stopped? Or would you have looked at his tears, at the people he came with, and found a reason to look away? Tell me the truth in the comments. Not the answer you wish were true, the one that's honest. If this story moved you, drop a heart so more people can find it. Share it with someone who still believes that quiet bravery has gone extinct, because it hasn't. It's just waiting for a moment that demands it. Somewhere out there tonight, a child is running barefoot toward a stranger. Be the stranger who stops.